Matt, thank you for coming. I'd like to introduce Matt Larsen-Daw. He's CEO of the Mammal Society, but in a previous life he worked for the World Wildlife Fund, and I understand was involved with, some of you might have seen the David Attenborough Wild Isles series on the TV. I think Matt was involved in that to some extent. So we're very pleased to have him come and talk about all the different mammals that you could possibly see here. Advice on keeping stoats out of houses would be good. Could you help on that, please?
Get a cat.
Yeah, we really look forward to hearing what you've got to say. So give a hand for Matt.
Thank you so much. Hello, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, so huge thanks for inviting me. And if we had tried to go ahead last week, I'm afraid it would have been a last minute cancellation. Firstly, the weather wouldn't have been a safe drive, but also my car broke down when I tried to drive it to Ullapool on the Friday. That would have been the case on Thursday evening, so I'm very grateful that we managed to make it work. So I'm here to talk about mammals, and I'm hoping it'll be more of a conversation as we go on through the evening, because I'm aware it's a room full of nature lovers, nature watchers, nature recorders, and you live here, so you'll know around this area, so you'll know what we have and what you're most likely to see, and maybe have a better kind of insider's view on how some of these species are doing and what the populations are like in this area. So I would love to hear some of that either tonight or going forward. And I'll be sharing some information about how you can particularly help with monitoring mammals in your local area for national good as well. And I'm aware you already do a lot of that with a whole load of taxa. So I was thinking how best to kind of structure this talk, because I have to draw the line somewhere. If we're here to talk for an hour and I tried to just tell you about every single mammal that you could find in this landscape, it would be basically a list and a few little stats that you could pick up from reading a book, and I wanted to make it more interesting than that. So I have honed it down a bit, and I'm hoping that the structure I've chosen in order to do that is not going to feel too silly to you. But before I go into that, I'll just give you a little bit of background. So as you heard, I'm from the Mammal Society, which I'm the CEO of. We are a national organisation, not just Scotland, UK-wide and in fact British Isles-wide. And our focus is this vision, a future in which sustainable mammal populations thrive as part of healthy and diverse ecosystems benefiting people and nature. And we do that in three ways chiefly. So the first is directly through science-based conservation work, so research and work out in the field to inform, support and enhance mammal conservation and also policies. So we're often the ones that are called upon when the government is determining the right approach for conservation policy, speaking up for mammals and making sure it factors in their needs. Another part of our mission is to empower anyone to play a role in mammal conservation through training and resources. We also have education work. There's various information here you can grab at the end, including a postcard about our training program, which is ever growing and also very responsive to what people ask for, particularly for our local groups. And one of the big things that we do at the Mammal Society is support a network of local groups all around the country to take part in mammal conservation and also just basically to be a kind of local advocate for mammal needs. We have now, since I moved up into the area a few years ago, a North West Scotland mammal group, which is called the North West Scotland Mammal Network. And we have, only a year before that, we got a North East mammal network founded as well by Rose, who's one of our council members. So the Highlands is now represented. The idea behind those networks, we called them networks for a reason, which is because we're not going to try and operate as a kind of fixed group of people that does a fixed group of things. We want to be a hub to enable anybody in the area to just have a kind of point of contact to find out what they could be doing, get some support to do that from the Mammal Society and from the local network, and just basically keep each other informed and keep a conversation going about mammals and mammal conservation that's locally relevant. So I forgot to bring a sign-up sheet, but I'm sure there can be some way of signing up if you want to share your email with me at the end, just to stay in the loop on that. Or I'm happy to start kind of putting one representative Assynt field group email so that you just know what's going on and you can circulate anything relevant to members. And then the last side of what we do is building public awareness of and support for mammal conservation. So that's through our campaigning work, our social media, basically our kind of just awareness, public engagement work. We run events and so on. And overall, what I think of as the role of the Mammal Society is kind of being at the intersection of the various different facets of mammal conservation, from grassroots volunteers, which are a hugely important part, as you'll learn as we kind of go through the talk, in all kinds of mammal conservation and monitoring. Academic research, which informs obviously a lot of science-based policy, and then also those policymakers themselves, where they need a nudge in the right direction when there's a need for mammals. Okay, so that's enough about Mammal Society, and I'm really happy to answer any questions that people have. But as I mentioned, the new group that started up is the Northwest Scotland Mammal Network. It only started last year, and we've been in a kind of building up stage. We haven't really done much yet, but the plan is to really be very active in 2025. So hopefully you will see lots of things happening that you can get involved in, or a kind of hub to support what you might want to do up here as well. And I'm the secretary, not the chair, and the chair is Tracy, who some of you who go further down the coast might know runs, is it Wild U Safaris? So she's quite engaged around nature monitoring as well, and has her own rewilding project in Cooley now. Okay, so without further ado, how have I framed the talk today to make sure that I can dive into some interesting detail about some mammals without just taking an arbitrary selection. So I've gone with this, given that we are over on the west of Scotland and it's very wild out there. I thought it's like the Wild West. So I've gone with the good, the bad and the ugly. So that's my framing for today. So these aren't the only three mammals I'll talk about, but that's how I've kind of grouped them together. And I'm sure some others will come up in the course of conversation. And I've put just a little catch-all at the end of mammals that I just don't have time to go into detail, but are worth a mention. And I have had to say right off the bat, I'm not going to talk much about bats, and I'm not going to talk about cetaceans at all, just because I can't cover everything. But both of those are extremely important. Okay, so I was going to start, when I first was thinking about how I'd kind of talk you through a bit of an overview of mammals in the northwest of Scotland and the issues they face, etc. I was going to go from smallest to biggest. But given that here in the northwest of Scotland we have the very smallest mammal and the very biggest, that meant basically covering everything. So I'm still going to start with what's often just grouped together as small mammals. And you'll often find references in conservation policies and land management to just small mammals, and they don't differentiate those creatures. And in some conservation projects, small mammals are quite dismissively referred to as just prey, which for a start is very unfair, because as we'll see, there's some amazing animals that fall into this category, and they really are worth celebrating in their own right. It also doesn't really recognise the hugely important role they play in the ecosystem. I mean, for a start, you shouldn't undervalue the value of prey. So we have, obviously, birds of prey. Often small mammals are their main source of food. We also have various theoretical reintroductions, so wildcats, pine martens in areas where pine martens have declined, although they're doing very well in much of Scotland, and even lynx. And with all of these animals, when you're thinking about a translocation or a reintroduction of one of these predators into an area, one of the things you have to do as part of the feasibility study is a prey abundance check. And often this becomes the downfall of an ecological feasibility study, because you have to look at the abundance, not just the presence. And what we tend to find with small mammals is that we know what's there, and that's partly because in most parts of the UK, with parts of Scotland being no exception, you will find all of the key small mammals that I'm going to mention. But what you don't get a sense of is how many there are of each, and maybe even what the relative population sizes are. And that doesn't just come from people's disinterest in small mammals, it comes from the fact that they are blooming hard to survey. So I don't know if anyone here has done any small mammal surveying. So I've got the main tool of the surveyor for small mammal surveying is here, which is a Longworth trap, which you're welcome to have a fiddle with at the end, which, as you can see, is as you'd expect from a small mammal trap. There's a tunnel with a mechanism inside that trips the door, and then you have a habitat box in here, which you can make nice and comfortable with some dried grass, a little bit of food to make sure that they're not going to starve. And whatever you get in there, the door closes, you're not going to get anything else in there from that point on, and then you go and check the traps and you see what you've got. So if you've got 50 traps, you've got 50 potential random samples of what small mammals are in the ecosystem. It's not a perfect science, because you'll only get what gets there first, and we have a considerable weighting towards wood mice. In a lot of habitats, particularly woodland habitats, and around here I think you'd have a big weighting towards field vole. And so you tend to get a really disproportionate number of whatever is the most common mammal in that area, small mammal in that area. And you might not get any of some small mammals, but it's not because they're not there, it's just because there aren't enough there that they get to the traps first. The other thing is there's an issue with shrews, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more as a species or as a taxa, and that's because shrews you're not actually meant to trap for with these, and that's because shrews are insectivores, they're not rodents, and they eat constantly, they have very fast metabolisms, and they eat all like over the 24-hour period. They just have small naps as they go. And so if you trap them, then they can't last very long in a trap situation, because they will either starve or they'll get dehydrated, or in some cases just because their metabolism's very high, they don't sleep very much, even if there is enough food, they can just get so stressed their little hearts give out. So with shrews you're meant to trap under certain conditions, and if you're not trapping under those conditions, which I'll just mention, you are meant to have traps with holes in that shrews can get out of. And that's not perfect, because if a shrew can get out of it, sometimes other mammals can as well, particularly juveniles, or they can almost get out, which is worse, because then you come to your trap and you find that one's tried to get out and it's ended up dying in the trap hole. So monitoring small mammals is a real nightmare. But our very smallest mammal, and that's in the UK and in this area of Scotland, is the pygmy shrew, which weighs as little as a 5p piece. And in fact I've got, it's got a little who am I from the schoolwork that I do, but actually I'll give the game away. These are examples of pygmy shrews, and anyone that does have a cat has probably seen a pygmy shrew dead, because cats do tend to find them and then don't eat them. And they are absolutely tiny. As I say, they eat constantly, and one of the things that allows them to do that, and as I said, they're insectivores, so they're eating crunchy little beetles, they're eating earthworms, maybe not pygmy shrews, they're a little bit too small, but common shrews eat earthworms, which are bigger and longer than them. And so to make sure that they don't wear their teeth down, they have enamel that deposits iron in their teeth. So if you find any of our native shrews, and I'll just mention the other native shrews in a moment as well as the pygmy shrew, but to use the pygmy shrew as an example, if they bare their little teeth at you, or if you find one that's no longer got its clothes on, so to speak, and is in an owl pellet or something, which I'll mention as well, they have red tipped teeth. And that red, which at first glance you might think has come from something it's eaten, it's maybe its blood, or maybe it's its own blood, it's actually the teeth themselves are red tipped and it's iron in the enamel. So that helps them be very resilient to wear and tear, and that is really essential for shrews because they just eat constantly. The other thing I'll mention about shrews actually, so I'm going to go along to this because I've started on shrews, so I'll finish. Shrews are physiologically absolutely incredible. So as well as the pygmy shrew being our very smallest and lightest mammal, the largest pygmy shrew might weigh a little bit more than the smallest pipistrelle bat. That's our other very, very light small mammal, but they do on average take the crown as the smallest. The common shrew is very slightly bigger, but it's still smaller than a mouse, really, really small. And if you're not quite sure what you're seeing, if you do find one, or if you spot one scurrying across the path, or you find one dead, then as well as size, you can go by colouring. So the pygmy shrew only has two colours. It has a kind of dusty grey-brown fur and then a pale underside, whereas the common shrew, which as I say is a little bit bigger, not very clear in this photo I've chosen actually, which is unhelpful, but it actually has three different colours. So if you could see the tummy there, the underside is very pale, almost white, and then it has a kind of lighter brown side panel, and then the kind of dusty grey-brown back that's more like the pygmy shrew on top. So that's a good way, if you've got a chance to actually study one, you can record exactly the species that it is, not just guessing because you think it's particularly small or slightly bigger, but by the fur. There is also a difference in tail length, but again, unless you've got the two side by side, that's not a very easy way to compare. But we're just moving into the winter. We've had our first week of severe winter up here, and shrews do, all of the different shrew species do an amazing thing in the winter. They shrink their size, and I don't just mean they lose weight, they actually shrink their bones, including their skull cavity, their organs, and even their brain actually becomes smaller for the winter, and then it grows back in the spring, which is a huge feat of kind of biology. And it feels like it's a lot of work for not that much reward, because they don't live much longer than a year at the outside. But if they cross the winter, they shrink down and they grow back up again. There's not a 100% explanation for this. Scientists only really have theories. It seems likely that means that they become more efficient, and so they can survive with less food. The counter to that, you might think, is that they don't have as much body fat either, which makes them maybe a little bit more vulnerable to the cold. But if they're constantly eating and constantly moving anyway, that might not be the issue. Being able to survive without finding as much food could be the driver there. But they are shape changers as a result. So, and that applies to the common shrew, it applies to the pygmy shrew, and it applies to the other species of shrew, or other native species of shrew, which is the water shrew. And the water shrew is an amazing creature. I could do a whole hour talk just on that. It's our only venomous mammal, and it dives. It creates a kind of pocket of air around itself as it dives, so that when it comes back out again, it's effectively not wet. And it's an amazing hunter. So water shrews are incredible in their own right. So these are, incredible creatures, each one of them, and they get lumped together as small mammals. Wood mouse, on the other hand, is probably more likely to have seen wood mice. There's not much difference between wood mice and house mice. They are different species. House mice isn't actually a true native, although it's been around for a very long time in this country. But wood mice do sometimes come indoors, so you haven't necessarily got a house mouse just because it's indoors. And around here it is more likely to be a wood mouse. But they are our most common small mammal across in the UK context. And as I say, and because they're pretty inquisitive, they're pretty confident, they do tend to be the ones that are picked up easiest in a trapping exercise. So back to small mammals generally, before I skip across and talk about voles. Small mammals, I've said don't lump them together because they're all amazing in their own way, but you can lump them together in one way, which is their kind of ecosystem benefits. And they're not just prey. That's one of my key messages about small mammals. They are playing a really, really important role in soil health. So they're tunnelling, they're burrowing, they're breaking up foliage at the ground level, and they're cycling nutrients because they're constantly eating and they're constantly pooing, and that's basically enriching the surface soil. Their burrowing is improving drainage. And when you're talking about thousands of small mammals in an area maybe not much bigger than the footprint of this building, then that is a really healthy functioning ecosystem that is then helping the soil be rich, the soil microbes to be in high quantities. It even helps with things like fungal, so the mycorrhizal networks, and it certainly helps with seed dispersal, pollination, and things like that as well. And what we have at the moment is a severe decline in the populations of small mammals. And it's really difficult to chart exactly how bad the decline is, because when you do trapping you just find what's there, but you don't know how many of them there are, you just know the number that you trapped is there. And you don't necessarily get a sense of the relative abundance. So this is becoming a kind of real issue for conservation, because what tends to be the focus for all kinds of conservation, mammal conservation no exception, is those species that we see are in danger of being lost. And so we have this red list of species, which you'll be well aware of, and then there tends to be funding available, so for example for water voles, because there are areas of the country where we know water voles have suddenly disappeared, and we're just worried about losing water voles altogether. So we pump money into trying to kind of bring them back from the brink. When you've got species that no one's really worried about losing from the landscape altogether, because if you go looking for them you will find they are there, they are not the focus for funding and policy, when in fact it could be that the foundations of the ecosystem depend not only on them being there, but on large populations of them being there. And before industrial agriculture, the chances are you would have found that even in a croft the size of this room, there's just thousands of those small mammals burrowing everywhere and doing those incredibly important things. And that is just not the case anywhere in the UK anymore. And in fact, some of the areas around here, some of the traditionally grazed crofts and things like that, we probably have a much better representation of what small mammal populations should look like than in much of England, for example, where there's industrial agriculture that's really changed that ecosystem. So let's love our small mammals, the key message there. So a quick mention for field vole, because they are probably, as I said, one of the most common small mammals in this particular area, and they are also one of the most important prey species. As you can see, they're pretty chubby. Birds of prey tend to find them among the easiest of the small mammals to catch, and they breed very quickly and in large numbers. They are just, they do eat small insects sometimes, but they mainly eat seeds and grass and petals. So they are just kind of lovely little converters of foliage and flora into food for the next level up of the trophic scale. So yeah, gorgeous little creatures and really important. So I mentioned the problems with small mammal surveying. It doesn't mean it's not worth doing. It's still, you get data, and sometimes you have no data, and having that data is really important. But we found that actually one of the best ways to get a more accurate picture of small mammal abundance and relative populations is by letting owls do the work of actually finding them, because we just don't see them. You might occasionally see one scurrying across, and you might not even have time to see whether it was a field vole, a bank vole, or even whether it was a vole or a mouse. But with owls, they will find everything that's there. And if you get a good sample of owl pellets, and I've got some here today, and I'd imagine that everyone here knows what an owl pellet is, and I don't need to explain it like I would in some groups. It's not a poo. It's what they cough up after they've had their meal, because they don't have teeth, they don't chew things. Everything gets swallowed whole, digested, and out comes the bones and fur that they can't pass through them. But as a result, you can pull these pellets apart and find whole skulls, jaw bones, all these kind of things which are identifiers of the small mammals that owl has found. And as I said, if you get a big enough sample, so these are all from the same place, collected at the same time, they would have been from the same few weeks of hunting, and you find out what's in there, and if there are shrews, if there are voles, if there are mice, and everything else that they would catch, they will be in those pellets, unless their populations are so small that you wouldn't be wanting to count them anyway, and you will get a sense of what the relative abundance is. And if you do that year on year, you get really interesting and useful data, because some of those small mammal populations go in a kind of boom and bust cycle, which can give you very misleading results if you only do a survey once every few years, because you might just happen to survey it when there's a huge abundance of field voles, and you might think that's how it always is, and it might be completely different the next year. But owl pellets are kind of an efficient and cheap way to do that surveying. The Mammal Society has a focus on owl pellet dissection at the moment, so our Searching for Shrews project, which you can pick up some information about here, is something you can get involved in, particularly in the winter months and when it's cold and you don't want to be going out and looking for field fare. You can be at home dissecting owl pellets for us. And we're also really keen to have owl pellets sent in. So if you know where barn owls are roosting, we can dissect basically any bird of prey pellets, but barn owls are particularly good because they find all of the different levels of small mammals. They can eat quite large prey, and they don't have very strong stomach acid, so they don't dissolve the bones to the point when they break up when they're being crunched into pellets. So you get the whole skulls and everything, which is much easier to identify. So you can sign up to receive some pellets, and we give you a full guide on how to do it, which you can try out at the end if you like. I'll set one up at the back. And then one of the reasons why we focused on owl pellets specifically right now is because there's an urgent need to track the spread of a non-native shrew that has arrived in this country. So we're not sure exactly when it arrived, but we found out about it in 2022 when someone's cat brought it in. It was that they were a member of the Mammal Society and they thought I can't tell whether that's a common shrew or I don't know, it doesn't look like any of the shrews that I was expecting to find. So they took a picture of it, and one of our ecologists said, "That looks like a greater white-toothed shrew, can you send it in the post?" Which is an amazing number of small mammals, owl pellets and poos that pass through the postal system as a result of the Mammal Society every day, so I apologise. And it was indeed a greater white-toothed shrew. Since then, we've surveyed that area where the cat, Jeff, found that particular greater white-toothed shrew, and we know that there's quite an established population there. Also, he's caught another few. And then we started to spot check in as many areas of the country as we can, and we already know that they're in another county and possibly one which still needs verifying. And one of the ways that we're doing this is asking for owl pellet samples from all around the country, because that will give us this early warning of their presence in sites that currently we just have no idea that they're there. So we're using the data from the owl pellet dissections to just understand populations and population fluctuations of small mammals generally, which is a really, really under-recorded area. But it's also got this particular urgency around this non-native. Okay, just mentioned that, so there we go. Right, so that's small mammals. So I've given a good amount of time for small mammals because I just think they're brilliant and they are so often overlooked. And I've talked about the kind of issues with trapping, because that is the main way that we survey for them. But you can see why you do need some kind of mechanism like that, or owl pellets, because you just don't see them when you're going through the landscape. If you're going out and surveying for lichen, you can be pretty sure where to look, and you can be pretty sure that the lichen's not going to hide from you or change its shape in the winter. Well, it does kind of, but you can be pretty sure that you're going to get an accurate sample, whereas you can't with those elusive creatures. And this is a problem with mammal monitoring generally. I would say that most wildlife organisations that aren't specific for a different taxa, like lichen or moss, will tend to always lead with a mammal on the cover of their publications and their communications. If there's an article about wildlife generally in an area in a newspaper or magazine, they'll tend to have, whatever's the most charismatic, nice furry animal on the cover. Sometimes birds, but often it's mammals. And that kind of gives a false picture, I think, of the level that we actually know about mammals in the landscape compared to other taxa, but actually mammals are under-recorded compared to other taxa. And that is not because people don't care about them, it is because it's just a lot harder work. And it's not just the small mammals because of their size. So many mammals are nocturnal, are very, very good at hiding, particularly the ones that are prey, but predators as well. They tend to be in much fewer numbers in the landscape, they're easily missed. And so the more people that we have engaged in mammal monitoring around the country, the better we can kind of plug those data gaps. So that's one of the reasons why we're really keen to engage groups like yourself and encourage you not to give up on mammal monitoring as a part of whatever other wildlife surveying you might do, just because it's harder to get results. The other problem we have, and this is why I'm bringing it up at this point, with the mountain hare on the screen, is that people are quite unwilling to go out and do structured surveys if they don't think they're going to find the thing that they're surveying for. So we tend to get very biased data. So we get a kind of confirmation bias of places where we already know there are mountain hare, or we already know there are badgers, because the people who are taking part in the survey are nature lovers and they want to see those species, or they want to see the signs of those species, and so they go, oh, I know where I should go for that, and they go to somewhere where they know they're going to find it. We try to deal with that with randomised surveys, but then it's harder to engage people because they think, I'm not going to go out there and just traipse around because I'm not going to see anything. Of course, it's really important that someone does go and traipse around, because otherwise we don't find out the surprising results that they are there, and we can't confirm and we can't evidence when we're talking about like the endangered status or the need to class a species as endangered. We can't prove that actually they are declining or that they are missing from landscapes. So the mountain hare is our example for that. So some of you might have already heard about our mountain hare survey. If you haven't, that's one of the takeaways from today, because this is something you can all get involved in without going far from home. So the mountain hare survey was started a few years ago. It's the Mammal Society and the BTO, which might seem a bit odd, but the BTO have been very interested in mountain hare populations and how they relate to ground nesting birds and grouse farming and things like that. And then Nature Scott are actually the funders of this. But what we're trying to do is get a better picture of mountain hare populations and range in the Highlands. Because they are restricted to the Highlands, so the mountain hare is our only native lagomorph. A lot of people assume that the brown hare is native as well, because we have folklore about brown hare going back centuries, but they were introduced and they did drive the mountain hare out of a lot of the historical range that would have been mountain hare dominated. And now we have kind of a stronghold of them in Scotland. And there are areas, which I'm sure some of you will be familiar with, where you can almost guarantee you'll see mountain hare, even if it's just squished on the road. Because where they are doing well, you know, they're thriving in the way that rabbits do. You know, that you get whole families of them, they have enough food, so they continue to just survive. They don't have the predators they used to have in the landscape, which is obviously not necessarily a good thing, but it does mean that they can be a lot more visible. When an adult mountain hare is too big to really be viable prey for birds of prey, you know, it's got nothing really to stop it being quite visible on the hillside. Foxes will predate on mountain hare, so they do still have predators, but they're not there's not as many as they would historically. But then there's whole swathes of the Highlands where we just don't know whether they're there or not, and there's a real risk that some of these areas, which are definitely filled with mountain hare, give us a really false picture of how well mountain hare are doing. So one of the key issues around mountain hare is the relationship between their habitat and grouse moor. So wherever a landscape is managed for grouse, mountain hare do really well, because exactly the habitat conditions that are created for the grouse really help out the mountain hare. But then the grouse farmers don't like that because they can spread parasites to the grouse, and they can also disturb the nests. And so they would like to control them on grouse moors. And so this is a conversation that's kind of conservation versus economy, because it seems like there are so many mountain hare in some of these areas that it really wouldn't be a problem to cull them, for example. But it might be that as they disappear from a lot of their traditional range, because there's less cover, because there are all these other pressures on them, and the climate change is also a concern, they actually disappear. They're actually really focused, the populations are focused around grouse moor, and if you then start culling them and getting those numbers down, you could actually be driving the population very quickly to extinction. So that's about the conservation status. Sorry, that was a bit heavy straight away because I haven't talked about them yet, but mountain hare, who's seen a mountain hare? About half of you. Really special to see them, I think, particularly if you're lucky enough to kind of suddenly realise that there's one not very far away. They're gorgeous little creatures. They are sometimes mixed up, not with brown hare, which they don't actually look much like, because brown hares are so much bigger and have bigger ears, but actually more likely to be mixed up with rabbits. And I know you do have rabbits around here, because their size is more comparable to a rabbit. They are a bit bigger. But the giveaways to know that you've seen a mountain hare and not a rabbit. First of all, they don't dig burrows, warrens, there we go. So rabbits are obviously leaving quite visible signs of their presence at all times, and you won't see that if mountain hare are the species that are inhabiting that landscape. You don't tend to see them in large numbers, although you might see a few bouncing around on the hills together at certain times of year. And in the winter, they go this lovely white colour, but that's not what they look like all year round. They look like that in the summer, which is really like a rabbit. And in the spring and autumn, they're transitioning, so they're kind of like mottled. And then in the winter, they become nice and bright white, which makes them much more visible before the snow falls, and then much less visible, which is obviously the point, when the snow has fallen. However, all year round, they have these black tips to their ears, so that's the real giveaway if you're not quite sure what you're seeing from a distance. If you can just get your binoculars trained on them and you can see those black tips to the ears, then that's almost certainly a mountain hare. And then the other thing is if they decide to run away from you, they look very different in the way that they run. So you see how long their legs are compared to a rabbit's, and they're just the speed that they can go at. They are almost our fastest terrestrial mammal. The brown hare is actually slightly faster just because it's bigger. So that's mountain hare. So if you want to get involved in mountain hare surveying, it's just a nice thing to do when you're out in the landscape. Sorry, I'm just skipping over these because I've already talked about it, but the difference between mountain hare and brown hare is actually quite distinct. So the brown hare does sometimes have little black tips as well, but as I say, the not always, and the colour, the colouring and the size and the face shape are really quite different. Whereas, as I say, with the rabbit, the length of the ears and the expression and so on is a little bit different. One of the key differences, actually, apart from the ears, it's harder to see, but is actually their eyes. So the colour of the eyes between the hares, brown hares, which are these kind of weird bright orange, and the rabbits, which are almost black. The mountain hare has these nice chestnut brown eyes, so that's another distinguishing feature. But yeah, so we're aware of the distribution that mountain hare would traditionally have had, and we're really trying to just get a better grasp on whether that's still accurate and to what extent they're declining. Because we know they have definitely declined severely in certain areas, but we just don't know whether that's just because they're shifting slightly in their range and actually the population's doing well. So that's a bit of an urgent multi-year project. And you can get involved by signing up to do the survey. There's a link from the Mammal Society website with all the information about the survey there, but actually it's the BTO that are running the process for signing up for a grid square. I've done quite a few of these, including in this area. It really is randomised, which means that you might go for a priority square, which are the red ones. That's what you'll be prompted to do, and you'll get it, and you'll know what it's like around here. You might just go, oh, that's manageable, that's only like half a mile from the road, that's fine. And then you get there, and that half a mile is impassable, and so you might struggle. But that is the way that we can try and make sure that without covering literally every square metre of the Highlands, we get an actual meaningful sample, because we're kind of randomising the landscapes that we're checking in. And you can actually record your survey using our app, which is the Mammal Mapper app, which is just a free app you can use for this and also any other mammal recording that you do. We don't keep that data to ourselves. The data is verified by iRecord, so it's just as quick and effective as using iRecord in terms of getting your data into the kind of national databases, and then it's distributed to the local record centres and into the NBN, the National Biodiversity Network. But we make it nice and easy with the Mammal Mapper app. That's the idea. So you can just turn the app on, say, tell the app that you're doing a mountain hare survey. There's 3 different kinds you can do. One is a square survey, where you walk 2 transects within the square, so that you really just had a chance to check for signs effectively. Or you can do a ramble survey, which is if you're just going for a nice walk, or if you need to follow a certain path because that's the only option, and it just tracks where you go and you record what you see. Or you can do the ad hoc recording, which is where we don't know if you went out and did a walk and didn't see anything, but with an ad hoc, if you weren't planning to do a survey but you did see a mountain hare, it's still really valuable, obviously, to have you record that. It's really difficult to tell whether they're there unless you see a mountain hare. So with most of the mammals that I'm going to talk about today, or am talking about today, small mammals aside, you can, if you don't see the mammal, you're looking for the signs of the mammal, which it would be nice to say it's always footprints, but it's normally poo that you're looking for. And with a mountain hare, there are distinguishing features for the poo, but unfortunately they're almost exactly the same size as red deer poo. So that's red deer, that's mountain hare, and the differences are there. Red deer, they're big, they've got strong digestive systems, so everything comes out, and everything's eaten twice, but then it's the same with mountain hare, as I'll say. Everything comes out almost like a puree, and it's very dark and shiny. But then, if it's left on the hill for a little while, the rain makes it look a bit more rough, and it lightens in the sun. It becomes harder and harder to distinguish. But a mountain hare poo, on the whole, is lighter in colour, a little bit greenish yellow, and the key thing to look for is that it's lozenge shaped. So although it's the same size and shape looked at from one angle, if you kind of feel it, pick it up, it slightly flattens, so it's more like a kind of cough lozenge. But the other thing is that it's a lot rougher inside, and so you'll see whole bits of grass, and you'll never really find that much in a red deer poo. So mountain hare, if you do find mountain hare poo on the hillside, it will have been eaten twice. They are coprophagic. There is a particular term for the kind of coprophage they are, but I can't remember what it is, which means they eat their own poo. So they, when the first time that something passes through them, as it's coming out the bum, they basically eat it straight out of their bum. And then the next time they poo, it's a drier and more digested lozenge that comes out, and that's what they're leaving on the hillside. Okay, so that was mountain hare. Last, I think, of the good is the badger. And I know you've got plenty of badgers around here. It's actually really interesting to talk to Ian about the fact that badgers weren't here, or certainly not in the numbers that they are now, until kind of a particular point about, was it 60 years ago-ish? So they are doing very well in this area now, and I'm sure people have seen signs of badgers or seen badgers themselves, or hopefully not hit one with their car, but it does happen. But the badgers that we have in this area, they are basically living the same kinds of lives as badgers do across the rest of the UK. But if you're given a kind of survey guidance for badgers, and it's being created for the whole of the country, you'll actually find a lot of it doesn't apply when you're surveying for them around the west of Scotland, because there's a very rugged landscape here, and what you'll often be looking for with badgers generally is kind of paths through woodland, roughed up fallen logs where they've rubbed it till it's shiny because they go over it every day. And particularly you'll be looking for the sets, which are quite visible because they have lots of entrances and they dig out huge amounts of soil, so you get these big spoil heaps. In a lot of the northwest of Scotland, the landscape just doesn't really allow them to make sets like that. So there are obviously places where they can, and then there's kind of woodland with quite deep soil where they are kind of having the more traditional set life. But they will also have what's called hill sets, and this I think is what I've seen around here when I've been out surveying for mountain hare, and they're a lot harder to distinguish or harder to recognise as badger homes, because what they'll do is they'll just occupy existing little caves, maybe kind of where there's a hollow under a big rock, and they'll scoop out some soil, but it'll just be basically a little cave, and they'll have a few of those in an area so that they can have different spaces for different purposes. But they don't have the big tunnel system, and they're quite close to the surface when they're sleeping, but they're remote, so that's not a problem. But the things you can still look for, whether you're looking for them around here or in a woodland area, is the latrines that they dig. So they have quite a varied diet. So badgers eat lots of worms, slugs, grubs, beetles, whatever they can get. They'll also eat berries. and some foliage and roots. And so what their poo looks like pretty much depends on what they've eaten, but what they'll tend to do is dig out a hollow in the ground and do it in that. So a badger latrine is quite an easy thing to recognise as being a sign of a badger. Generally speaking, they will be joined to the set by a quite well-trod path as well, because badgers are creatures of habit and they'll tend to go the same route over and over again, so you can kind of see very distinctive badger trails. But that's pretty difficult around here, because if you see a path like that, it could be from all sorts of other animals, including deer, in fact, that often tread the same path as well. If you are interested, you might already be doing this in sort of helping study the status of badgers in Scotland. All of the Mammal Society Mammal Mapper data on badgers gets shared and is available publicly, but there is a particular survey methodology which is employed by Scottish badgers called the Get Set survey, and they give you lots of guidance and training. They probably come out specifically to do a training for this group because it's enough people to be worth their while, and just to make sure that you know exactly what to look for and how to get involved in that. Okay, now this is the last, I think, of the good. It's my favourite mammal. Are you allowed to have favourites when you're the CEO of the Mammal Society? I think so. So, our native otter, the Eurasian otter, we do only have the one otter in the UK, the Eurasian otter. So sometimes people think that what we have over on the coastal areas of Scotland and down in Wales are sea otters, because they're otters in the sea. Sea otters are not found in the UK, they're over in America and Canada, and they are proper marine mammals. So they are aquatic. They live their life, they sleep, and they come out rarely onto land. Whereas our otters are semi-aquatic, which means that they will go in and out of the water for their own purposes, but they live terrestrially, they live outside of water on the land. But the reason why there's a bit of confusion is not only because you see otters in the sea, but because they do seem to have different habits to the otters inland and in areas, particularly sort of inland in England and in the middle of Wales. River otters, which effectively these are, will come out, they'll be nocturnal, they'll come and hunt by night. And they are very much hidden during the day, whereas the coastal otters that we find around here, they might hunt in the rivers, but they will also come down to the coast because there is just a huge abundance of food, and they have adapted their lifestyle so they're no longer nocturnal. They will instead hunt when the prey is available, and the prey is most available when the tide's just started coming in. Because that's bringing things like octopus and crabs and various things that they eat. They'll pretty much eat any shellfish, any fish, and any octopus or squid that they can find. That's starting to bring them towards the shore, so they can, while the water's still quite deep, they can fish them out, bring them up on the rocks, and enjoy their meal. One of the reasons why they're prepared to do that is, of course, because they feel safer. So out in the coastal areas, they can go off in pretty much any direction, whereas they can easily be trapped in a waterway with a watercourse where there might not be favourable habitat on either side. As a result of feeling safer, and as a result of there being so much prey as well, our otters over here on the northwest of Scotland and in other parts of coastal Scotland, they're less solitary. So you'll sometimes find male dog otters not necessarily sharing a territory, that might be the wrong term, but prepared to hunt in the same grounds. They probably then go their separate ways, and they probably ignore each other, because otters traditionally, or by habit, are solitary when they are males, and then they come together to mate, and then they go and be solitary again. And the females have their cubs, who stay with them for about a year. And then if they're males, they go off and find their own territory and start being solitary as well, while the females will start their own litters somewhere else with a dog otter. But that's no longer the case so much here. So you'll find that otters will share territory a lot more on the coastal areas. And they stay together as families for a lot longer as well. So a lot of the reason why those those family units break up is obviously just to kind of stop competing so much for limited prey in a limited river system, for example. So yeah, absolutely beautiful. And I'll mention this. That was in there just because it's a nice picture from Scotland. It's not from this area actually. I think that one's from Mull. But I put it in there because it's a highly commended photograph from our Mammal Photographer of the Year 2023. Our annual photo competition is open at the moment for 2025's awards. So if you do take photos in this area, we'd love to have submissions from you. It's free to enter. There's prizes and the glory. And it's one of the ways that the Mammal Society gets some really lovely illustrative imagery that we ask permission from the photographers to use in our communications as a charity. So we kind of recognise photography, but we also get to kind of communicate about mammals better. Okay, so tracking otters, as I said, you're in a privileged position of being able to see them quite easily. Has everyone here, well I shouldn't ask, who here has seen an otter with their own eyes? There you go. So, and so much of the UK, even the most avid nature lover just won't have managed to see one. They might have seen it on a camera trap. If they're really dedicated and they're a photographer and they go out and spend nights in a hide, they'll have seen one. But seeing an otter is not something that everyone gets the privilege to do, and we are very lucky here because, if you're walking along the coast, they're there at the right time. But you can look for their signs. They're also quite visible. They have quite distinctive little five-pawed feet. If it's a really nice soft substrate like this, you can tell that there's webbing between the toes. And you might even see the claws from that point. They're very round in total, as you can see. The thing you're most likely to mix them up with is perhaps a cat, a domestic cat, but other than that, you can be pretty sure you're seeing an otter. And the other thing to look for is their spraint. So that's the particular name for what otters leave behind, and it's very distinctive. I've got a little tub of it here, which anyone is welcome to come and have a look and a sniff. So it's the one mammal poo that I'm sort of happy to bring hare and deer poo in for like school sessions and things like this, but I always make sure I've got some spraint because it's not particularly unpleasant to smell. Some people absolutely hate it, I'll admit. But when you sniff otter spraint, the thing that comes to mind is not, oh god, that rank smell of poo. But it's a kind of fishy but also aromatic smell. Some people say it smells like jasmine tea. If you want to test that theory, I wouldn't say you should boil it and drink it, but you should definitely have a sniff. But yeah, otter spraint's quite distinct as well. And actually, otter spraint is something which is also surveyable. So we're going to be bringing out a book like this, which we've done for owl pellets on otter spraint analysis, because you can actually learn a lot about what otters are eating, where they're going to find their food, but then also about what's in the ecosystem from what's in an otter spraint. So obviously they're not eating mammals, they will eat small mammals sometimes, but they're mainly eating fish, whether it's river fish, freshwater fish, and shellfish or coastal. But that's really important biodiversity data as well. Right, just going to check time. Oh gosh, okay. So, right, I'm just aware that my talk is meant to be wrapping up and I'm still on the good. So I'm going to speed things up a little bit and make sure that I cover the bad and the ugly and then give some time for questions. But yeah, this is right outside my house. Spraint on a rock. They leave their spraint in very visible positions because they're markers for other otters. And you'll be able to see the trails because they will tend to take the same trusted routes, particularly when they're crossing from a watercourse to either another watercourse or to the coast, and you might even find a nice little slide at the end. So those kinds of signs of otters are pretty distinctive, and then you'll know it's worth putting a camera trap out or it's worth keeping your eye out when you're in that area. So I'm on to the bad. So I should start by saying there is no such thing as a bad animal. It's just a good animal in the wrong place. So it's bad for the landscape. Mink are a perfect example of that. American mink, it's not their fault they're here. They were brought in to be farmed for fur, and there were a number of, and the last fur farms in the UK were up here in Scotland, and they were released by animal rights protesters in huge quantities, and as a result, mink populations were established in various parts of the country and have spread. They look a bit like otters. They are actually quite a lot smaller. So although you're seeing close-up pictures of one and then close-up pictures of the other, these are about the size of a cat. Otters are about the size of a dog, very roughly. But they do look quite similar from a distance. So sometimes people think they've seen an otter because they'll be in the same kind of river or coastal locations, and they might be dipping in and out of the water. They might look sleek. But they do have really distinctive differences if you know what to look for. So the ears are prominent, whereas they're not on an otter, because an otter spends more time underwater and is more adapted to that. And particularly their tail is bushy, whereas an otter's is sleek. So if you're not sure about size and you're looking from a distance, that's the key identifier. So why are mink bad? They are bad simply because they are in the wrong ecosystem, and they wipe out certain populations of animals that we treasure and need as part of our ecosystem, because their hunting habits are developed for a different ecosystem. So again, it's not their fault, but we do need to make sure that we control their population. So water voles are the most at risk, and that's because as well as being a tasty treat and quite substantial as a prey animal, they're much bigger than field voles. They will tend to go to ground in their burrows to get away from predators, which works for them mainly because most of their predators can't follow them, but mink unfortunately can. There are other predators that will get water vole, like weasels and stoats, but their hunting habits are completely different. They will not just keep on hunting in the same area until they've wiped out the available prey. A mink will. It's just its behaviour. So if it finds a population of water vole, it will just feed on the water vole until there are no more water vole left on that watercourse, and then it will move on to wherever next it can find available prey. So that's why we need to control mink. There are ways that we can do that. There's a Scotland-wide Nature Scot funded project to control water vole, to control mink. And the general way that it's done is by putting out mink rafts with traps. These dowels here are meant to try and exclude otters by making them a bit wide, but actually otters don't tend to want to go into traps in the first place. Mink are very inquisitive, very bold. They'll go in if they see some bait, whereas otters tend not to. The juveniles will occasionally go in, so obviously these need to be, well, they need to be checked regularly anyway, because it's obviously you don't want to be inhumane in the way the mink is dealt with. You don't want it to starve to death in a trap. But the way that it tends to be done, you take the box off, so it's just left with the cage. You use these paddles to kind of limit the size, the space that it can be in, and then it's dispatched with a humane gunshot to the back of the head. So it's a horrible job because mink are not to blame for the problems they cause, and they are lovely creatures in their own right, but the control of them to the point when we don't have a big population is the best way to avoid having to do this lots. Because without controlling them, we'll just lose other species and have more and more problems. So if this is something which you're prepared to do for the good of the ecosystem, there's always a great demand for volunteers who are prepared to do a bit of mink control and monitoring. And if anyone's got a firearms licence, which now you need even for an air gun in Scotland, there's always a demand for people who are prepared to go and do the horrible job at the end. And then the other bad I wanted to highlight was deer. I'm not going to put my hand up and see if you've seen them. And I focused on red deer. I know you get roe deer around here, which is our other native species of deer in the UK. Much smaller, very pretty, and also can be the cause of some of the problems I'll talk about with red deer, but not to the same extent. And up here, it really is red deer because of their size, the numbers, that they are an issue. Again, they are not bad. Red deer are amazing and they're iconic. They're part of the Highlands landscape, and it's not their fault that the ecosystem has changed. They no longer have wolves maintaining their numbers. A lot of the forest has gone, which is, again, wasn't because they destroyed what was standing. They might stop forests from regrowing, but they didn't take the trees away in the first place. And so a lot of the problems they cause in the landscape in terms of keeping it denuded and obviously straying across roads and causing accidents is just because that's the landscape that they are now in. But red deer are, as I say, amazing creatures and a lot of folklore around them. They used to be called fairy cattle up in the Highlands and also over in Ireland, which was the belief, because they moved in herds, that someone was kind of maintaining and controlling them and then milking them, and so the idea was the fairies were milking them up on the hills and then they would come down to pasture and so on, which is a lovely thought. But yeah, I probably don't need to say too much about red deer. I think we're aware of the issues that they are causing because of the numbers, and it's a difficult thing to know how to deal with in the long term. But obviously what we'd like is a sustainable population of them that is. And it should be noted that as a sustainable population within the ecosystem, some of the things which we find are problematic about having the large numbers are actually really important ecosystem services. So the way that they kind of stamp down the foliage and break the surface of the ground when it's not a peat bog, and obviously leaving lots of poo behind as they're eating the grass. They are actually doing a really important service that we would miss if they weren't in the landscape at all. It keeps variety of flora at the ground level and keeps the soil compacted and all sorts of things. Okay, so last of all, the ugly. So I'm not talking for too much longer. So again, really unfair. It's a lovely creature, but the reason I've put the grey seal in here as the ugly is because scientists, when they were naming the species for the first time, clearly did think it was ugly, because does anyone know what its scientific name means? Haliocaris grippus. How's your Latin?
Something that was salt. See?
It's not the sea. Oh no, the sea's in there. You're right. Yes. It's actually hook-nosed pig of the sea, which I think is very unfair. But obviously, it's differentiating grey seals from common seals. I will just mention, but yeah, grey seals are very visible in this part of the world. I think you get more common seals along this stretch of coastline than grey seals, but I'm sure you do get grey seals. I wanted to give them a special mention at the moment because they are in pupping season. So unusual, strangely I think, but nonetheless it's the case. This is the time of year when female grey seals are pupping, and they do that up on the shore, so they come and give birth on the shore. So this is the giving birth. There's it looks gory, but that's just the placenta, and there's the little pup, and there's the mother knackered afterwards. There's this new one. And then there's a seagull enjoying the placenta at the end of it. So at this time of year, there will be secluded little beaches and bays where mothers, sometimes in groups but sometimes individually, come out onto the beach, give birth, and then they will stay on the beach with their pup for a month. So they need to be pretty fat and full of food by the time they give birth, because then they're not going to feed for quite a long time, and they're going to be giving milk to their pup, who puts on a huge amount of weight from the birth weight in that month, just having mother's milk. Grey seals can't swim in that time, so they're stuck on land, and the mother's there basically to protect them as well as to give them food. And they've got this fluffy white coat that would not be waterproof if they were to go into the sea, and they wouldn't be able to swim anyway. By the time that month is up, they pretty much shed that white fur, and they'll have their waterproof suit on, and they could go into the water, but they're still not confident, they're still not old. So what the mother does is the mother then just leaves them and goes off to find food herself, and then the pup is kind of just left without anyone looking after it and without any food, to the point when it just realises, oh, I'm going to have to go and find my own, and then goes off into the sea. And kind of that's nature's way of basically throwing them in at the deep end. As a result, sometimes people report abandoned seal pups at this time of year, when actually it's just the natural course of things where they're up on land, either because they're only going into the sea for short amounts of time, but they are actually at the point when they should be fending for themselves. But what happens from time to time is that human disturbance, or dogs, or sometimes a noisy fishing boat, scares the mother away, and leaves a pup that is still mother dependent, still being weaned. So, with the fluffy white coat and everything, they cannot survive if they are left on their own like that. And grey seals, although the population is on the increase, they have been at the point of extinction within a lifetime, in the 80s. And so they're still not in huge numbers, and it is something which is worth kind of protecting. So where a seal is abandoned like that, they will actually do absolutely fine if they're just taken off the beach and given food and somewhere warm and safe for a bit until they are old enough, and then they can be thrown in the sea, because that's what would have happened to them anyway. They would have had to just work it out for themselves when they get thrown back in the sea. So BDMLR, the British Divers Marine Life Rescue, sort of encourages people to report seal sightings, but not to go and intervene unless you're a trained medic and you know how to assess the situation and then deal with it, because they can give a very nasty bite, and it can be very toxic as well. It can cause your hand to fall off. So you need to approach them in the right way. But also because a lot of the time people will think it needs help, and actually the assessment will be, no, that one's fine. So that's grey seals. There's loads of interesting to say about grey seals, so I'm sorry I've run out of time. I was just going to sort of compare the difference with common seals, or harbour seals as they're also known, which have this more kind of concave snout. Looks a bit more cat-like, whereas grey seals look a bit more like dog or horse-like. Very, very cute, although they're both beautiful animals, and very convivial. Grey seals are bigger, they can be a little bit more aggressive. But when they're all bobbing around together in the sea, sometimes it can be hard to tell them apart.
Banana seals.
Yes, bananaing. So bananaing is, I don't know if that's a technical term, but everyone calls it that, is what they do to basically conserve their body temperature. So they just try and keep as much of their body off the cold stone and away from the cold water as possible. And they're so flabby. Sorry guys, but you are. But that means they can adopt that position very comfortably, and even kind of sleep like that, or doze like that as well. They will sleep in the water, both grey seals and common seals. They don't have to come out on land to sleep, although they'd need to come out from time to time, otherwise they wouldn't get the proper sleep that they need. But if they're out hunting, they can bottle in the water, which is when they go vertical, and they're so buoyant that they're not using any effort to keep their head above water, because obviously they're mammals, they need to breathe air, and they will be able to get some rest that way, and then they'll swim and do a bit more hunting. Eventually they will need to come out to have a proper sleep. And there we are. Okay, so I did just stick a few extra ones at the end that didn't fall into any of those categories particularly, or I didn't have time to tell you much about them. So I won't, because I've gone over time. But these were some of the ones that you could have had. The hedgehog, which is declining terribly and is now on the IUCN Red List, but there's things we can do to bring them back. The red squirrel, which isn't in this particular area of northwest Scotland, it has been in the past, it could be again. I think this club at some point in the past did a feasibility assessment on the reintroduction of red squirrels, and determined that socially everyone would like it, but there probably isn't enough habitat, so it isn't really a good bet to throw them in to this area at the moment. Pine marten, I'm sure you do get. They can travel between even small fragments of wood, and they range quite a long way for their hunting. But yeah, amazing animals. I decided I wouldn't talk about bats because it would just be going into a whole new area, but the pipistrelle bat there will be in this area. And so just wanted to finish by saying, please do download our Mammal Mapper app. It's free and it's on all the Apple and Android, and it just makes it easy for you to record mammals with all the information that makes it a really useful biodiversity record, and it also has a little database on there with what the footprints look like for each mammal and so on, so it's just quite a useful reference in your pocket. And that's it. If you are interested in the Mammal Society or not already a member, if you go to the website and sign up as a member, we'd really love to have you on board individually. You might, as a group, want to kind of be part of the Northwest Mammal Network and get involved in some of our surveys. And I have some of our crap calendars here available for the special price of £10 if anyone's interested.
Thank you, Matt. It's a shame that you had to wrap up because I could have listened for another 2 hours or whatever. Anyway, got any questions? Yes.
I was surprised to find a hedgehog living by my house. And I just wondered how common that is up here. I don't know if anyone else has seen hedgehogs around, but basically I live in a company property and someone had left a dish that said hedgehog on it, and I was like, there's no way there's a hedgehog here. But it quite regularly makes its way through the garden, and we haven't really got woodland around. I live in Applesbury, it's pretty woodless. There's a sort of scrubby area next to my house, but
Yeah, well, so hedgehogs should be in this area, ideally, because they should be, even if sparsely, throughout much of the UK. They're quite adaptive, so they can live in woodland, but they can also live just as long as there's a little bit of cover, hedgerow or whatever. They just need somewhere to be able to sleep and connectivity for their hunting. The issue is, so hedgehogs have declined massively over the last few years, so it's actually good news that you've got one in an area where we know they are sparse.
no, I'm just worried it's alone.
Yeah, well, it might be. Well, so there's also been some releases. I don't know if it would have made its way all the way up from Hartlepool, but it's possible. There's been releases of rescued hedgehogs in Hartlepool, and one of the reasons for that is that actually they are doing much better, and this is across the UK, not just in Scotland. Where they are doing better is in urban areas, which is kind of counterintuitive, but a lot of the agricultural area, especially with the rural areas, the soil quality, the food abundance has been sort of decimated. The connectivity of the landscape's very bad. I mean, they'll find nothing to eat in like a big ploughed field of agricultural land, so that whole area is kind of devoid of anything of value for hedgehogs. The hedges, if they still have hedges, they'll be able to both move, sleep, and find food there. So hedgehog is quite a good answer. But they find all of those things in urban areas where people are maintaining their gardens in a nature-friendly way. And it used to be really bad because everyone was using slug pellets to control garden pests, and of course slugs eat them. It takes a little while for them to do what they're meant to do to the slug, but whether it has or not, a hedgehog can eat that and then get the poison itself. And so hedgehogs declined even in urban areas very, very badly. But now they seem to be up on urban areas because people are being, leaving a bit of food out for them at times when otherwise they might struggle because there's, not a huge amount around, or it's a small area. But most importantly, there's places, people are leaving wild areas, or there's places under sheds where they can hibernate. It's one of the only 3 kinds of mammal in the UK that hibernates this time of year. So yeah, it's good news. It's not unusual or anything to be surprised about. It's just really nice to hear. It would be great if it's not alone. But I guess we'll find out and see if it has.
Well, I hope so, yeah.
See if it has cubs.
The alien shrew you mentioned, is it known whether it has any bad effect on existing populations?
So, yeah, good question. We only know what it's done in Ireland, where it came in as a non-native probably about 30 years ago. In Ireland, it's been a real problem. It's basically decimated the population of pygmy shrews. So their native shrew population has just turned on its head. They didn't have common shrews so much, in fact, at all, I think. They basically had just pygmy shrews was the main kind of, that level in the ecosystem of small mammals, of shrews, was pygmy shrews. And now they've been replaced by greater white-toothed shrews, and they are a problem. So it's not just the loss of that species, the kind of replacement of the species of shrew that we did have.
Is it the food?
Well, they are bigger, and they a bit like grey squirrels versus red squirrels. They'll tend to kind of become a larger population in an area, which has an effect on other small mammals. They're not as good as a prey species. They're not as good as, for example, voles and mice, but they start to kind of dominate the ecosystem at that level. So we don't know whether that same thing will happen here. It's not a completely comparable ecosystem. So at the moment, the real thing we need to do is monitor and discover whether or not they are causing a problem. And we'll do that by monitoring the small mammal populations. But we could easily have not got that notification in 2022 that they were here, and they could have had another decade of kind of getting established, and we'd be at a starting point in 10 years' time, and we could discover at that point that things have already changed and we can't intervene. So we're actually quite lucky that we've got this kind of opportunity, because we're already seeing that there doesn't seem to be, there's these areas where we know that they've established a population. It does seem to be contained. We're not finding like loads of records suddenly pour in from everywhere else in the country. That's good news. And we will hopefully know as soon as they do start to appear in a certain area. So we can start to monitor the impact on other shrews and other small mammals in the areas where we know they're established, and then be ready, hopefully, to start acting if necessary as they spread. But at the moment, in the areas where we know they're established, we are still getting we are still getting pygmy shrews, so they're coexisting, and we are still getting common shrews, and we are still getting the other small mammals. But that could just be because they've actually only been here for a few years, so we need to keep on monitoring. So the short answer is we don't know, but it could be a problem, but we're going to try to find out in time.
Still on that subject then, to Pastor, where did they come from, and did they get dealt with in the same way as mink?
So you can't deal with them in the same way as mink, because they're
I mean, the end result.
so it's really different. So we don't quite know. What we're hoping is that we will monitor. We'll have this early kind of sighting on what they're doing. We'll find out that actually they're not particularly a problem. They'll remain an invasive, or no, they'll remain a non-native, which means that if you were to accidentally trap one, you wouldn't be able to release it back into the wild. That's the same with any non-native, because we just try and retain it. But they wouldn't actively probably go out and try and control them, because it'd be very difficult to do. But we don't know. We'll see, because there are ways to consider, but we just hope we're not going to have to consider them. But where they came from is a really interesting question. We don't know. We assumed they'd come over from Ireland at some point, maybe in a shipment. My theory was maybe chicken feed or something like that. They would have had plenty to eat on the journey, and then they've ended up here. But we've done some DNA testing, and it seems they are not the same strain as Ireland. So that leaves us with a big question. So again, it could be that they've come over from Europe in something like chicken feed, something where there could be like delivery after delivery brings in a new consignment, and then they've been able to spread. And there is a big chicken farm near Nottinghamshire where this, Derbyshire is where the first population was found. Nottinghamshire is the other one. So you know, that's my kind of pet theory, but we don't know yet, and we need to do some more DNA testing comparing with some other species to see if we can work that out.
That implies that at borders there's not a proper check on foodstuffs coming in there.
Yeah, so that could be a real constructive outcome from this, would be an identification of a problem that can actually be dealt with. So if we can prove where the entry point was, and we can show that there's a risk of that continuing with this and other species, we can actually make sure that that's changed. So we could actually kind of change something valuable as a result of this research.
Yeah.
Moles are quite patchy around here. We note them wherever we see them, and I suspect they're still being controlled. Any comment on that?
Yeah, well, my comment is always I wish people wouldn't control them, because they're so valuable, and most of the idea of them being a pest comes from this cosmetic idea of nice lawns being damaged. Like, of course, there are some issues with agricultural land where they create their tunnel systems, and they create these multi-level tunnels. They have their food hunting tunnel that's relatively near the surface, and they have their tunnel for feeding and sleeping in, and that means that heavy equipment can go over and kind of collapse in. So that's one of the reasons why they are controlled, is that farmers see them as a pest for that reason, and they can damage root crops as well. But overall, there is no real reason. They don't cause as much of an issue as they seem to have this reputation for doing. And it is just people think of them as a pest because they think a little pile of earth rather than a nice clean lawn is a problem. So I'm hoping that that's gradually changing. But if you Google moles just to get information about them as a species, the whole search return is how you kill them.
Yeah.
And you don't find that, you find that with mice as well, actually, but not quite to the same extent. Moles, it just seems ubiquitous, and actually some of the top search returns are pest control companies, and I find that strange. And I think one of the reasons is, although we've got like the wind in the willows and things. We've got like a few occasions where moles have been picked up as this kind of charismatic species, but people don't see them very often. Like, they don't see any of the small mammals, but particularly moles because they're underground. And I think it's ridiculous to say this, but I think because they don't have visible eyes, people don't emotively connect with them, and so it's much easier for them to just kind of be seen as this pest. Anyone that's actually seen a mole alive in reality will know that they are brilliant, and they're so, like, they are charismatic, but most people haven't, and I think that that's partly the reason. But yeah, in terms of how they're doing, they are very underrecorded. And in fact, that's something which we're really encouraging our supporters to do in local groups, because obviously you don't see the moles necessarily, but you can definitely tell they're there if you see the molehills, and we want people to record them. But people are either used to seeing the molehills because molehills are there, and so they don't bother recording them because they don't see them as being part of the landscape. Or they're not there, but we don't know that they're not there because they're not telling us that. So it's something which we're probably going to have to get on top of, because there's a danger that moles are going to go the way of the hedgehogs, because both are indicators of healthy landscapes. They need good food abundance within the soil, and they're affected by farming practices, and they're affected by soil erosion.
We have found them in very remote places on our Kunyag survey.
I was wondering how they
and
get
you
them.
wonder how they ever meet up to procreate, because it seems to be miles. You get a patch of grassland, which is not that common up in the hills anyway, and there will often be moles.
Yeah.
But then you go a very long way before you come to the next
I
suitable habitat.
I'm genuinely fascinated. I think it's a real mystery, because there is the way that they do it, where there is a good landscape mosaic and moles are doing all right in an area. The life cycle is that they spend their entire life underground, apart from this point when they are first reaching adulthood, and then they go above ground, so that they're leaving the entire tunnel system, and they scurry along the ground, and then they find somewhere else and start their own tunnel system. So that's when they're most vulnerable. But yeah, they are spreading and spreading genetically by moving above ground. And obviously, as you say, when you find these isolated areas where they're existing, you think, well, what was the connectivity to get here? I just think, it amazes me. So genuinely a bit of a mystery, and it would be very interesting to know.
I was going to ask you, I was interested in the Northwest Mammal Group, and also the history of our mammals that we have here, because even like the badger, a lot of people will tell you, a couple of 100 years ago, we didn't have badgers. Osgood Mackenzie, you know about him, he said he was the first person to bring rabbits in. People say when rabbits came in with the Romans, but the Northwest they weren't there. Even hedgehogs, there's not many records of hedgehogs in this area 100 years ago. So that's three species that, they're native obviously to this country, but should they be here? And any comment on that?
Yeah, so I mean, it's really difficult to say absolutely, because when records began, you're at this kind of arbitrary point really. So 70 years ago is really when we start to get really accurate records on a lot of species, and even less time sometimes in parts of the Highlands. But there's a good reason to think that both badgers and hedgehogs, as two of the examples you gave, would have been part of the ecosystem further back. And it's quite possible that they were lost, because obviously the landscape changed a lot, and not just in the Highlands, not just in Scotland, but UK-wide. And so this is actually a sign of recovery in some cases, which is positive. Some of that's speculation, and we have things like the bone caves we were talking about earlier, which sometimes give us a little snapshot, but then that's going even further back, so that's even, sometimes confuses the issue. So it is very difficult to say for sure, but where there are native species, where the habitat supports their existence, it's kind of, generally speaking, the more biodiversity, the better. And hedgehogs are a good example. They are not going to cause any harm. So badgers, some people would say, if you've got badgers and the ecosystem can't support them, they could cause issues. I don't think that is the case, but there is at least there's a rationale for the argument there. Hedgehogs are an example where actually, if the landscape can support them in their presence, they're not going to be doing any harm. It's just a good sign that the ecosystem's healthy enough to support them. And that's the same for others as well. So in the kind of badger camp, There's also pine martens, which is another example where people are desperate to get pine martens back in their area. And it seems like a really nice thing to do because it's like it's a level of the ecosystem or a species in the ecosystem they don't have and they feel like they could have. But of course you do have to think really carefully about whether you introduce an animal like a pine marten. So for example, if you've got a vulnerable red squirrel population, you bring in pine martens, they will hunt red squirrels. They don't only hunt red squirrels and they don't hunt them to excess, but you could wipe out a burgeoning population there. But you don't have to worry about certain species, and hedgehogs is one of them. So.
Sorry, just to jump in, but I do wonder about that on islands, small islands.
Well, no. Oh, good point. Yeah, I should have said that. They are a problem in small islands because they affect ground nesting birds. Yeah, you're quite right. So we've actually been trying to bring them over from some of the Hebrides where they've established. Yeah, sorry, that was a really misleading thing to say given the island situation. You're right. So yeah, that's exactly one of the things that's happening, and they are tend to be brought over alive, trapped, brought over alive, and released on the mainland. And obviously they would have had to have been taken over there, probably deliberately, by probably someone that thought it was a lovely idea, and is now probably very embarrassed. But yeah, well, yeah, I mean, it would have been a while ago that they would have been established, but not that long ago potentially, because they obviously have no natural predators over there, and that's one of the issues. So yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up because I would have left that in a slightly misleading note.
We've all been racing.
Exactly, the hedgehogs can go anywhere.
Badgers do have a Gaelic name, and there is one locality I know, Ishbraki, on the Akidibui Road, where there is a Rhue brocker or something like that. There's either badger or badger hunter. That there is the one brocker. Place name. I don't know one in Assynt, but so they must have existed way back to have a Gaelic name, probably.
Yeah, no, well, I think so. Badgers, as an example, actually, I think there's badgers in some of the old Highland family crests. I think so. That's an indication that they are probably sort of culturally ingrained.
There's a Gaelic word for an ostrich.
Oh, is there? Yeah. Okay, well that certainly cancels that point.
It's probably ostrich.
And it is a Latin actually, when I think about broch, it's a Latin.
Yeah.
It's a Latin word. But yeah, you know, it's I was actually thinking though that when you think of population densities around here, they were quite high before the clearances. And then they dropped away again. I mean, is there a correlation between the number of small mammals? You know, do small mammals actually do better where humans are?
Well, it's about land use really. So I think it's probably land farming practices and farming traditions. And I think they probably did change a lot as a result of the clearances.
Because during before the clearances, they had their unrid systems and their common grazings and things, and maybe more worms available. I was it just set up a thought in my mind. You were saying about the fluctuations of population, whether they correlated with the human.
Well, the fluctuations that I mentioned with voles is their biology. So they wherever they are, and whatever the population is, they have big breeding years, and then they go. Yeah.
Mice, for instance.
Yeah, mice and shrews. Yeah.
Yes, and I had I got a lovely photograph actually of a pine marten on my bird feeder eating the sunrise.
Oh, lovely. Yeah, they did on.
You know, humans are not necessarily bad.
There's only one record of house mice in this area, and it's an ancient one for Stoer. But they used to have to keep the oatmeal in lead-lined kists in the shop. But that was probably house mice. I guess it could have been wood mice. But I mean, it's a curious thing. That's most of the Highlands. There are very, very few house mice records at all. They don't seem to be here any longer. There's one, only one for this area, and it's a historic one.
Yeah, no, I can believe that. Obviously, they can come in a number of ways with shipments, deliveries, and boats and stuff. But then in this area, kind of unusually, and compared to a lot of the world as well as a lot of the UK, if you were to wipe them out of one area, which literally one cat can do, you can get a house mouse free. There's big areas where there's no connection between housing areas. So yeah, it could be that they were there for a bit and then they've gone completely, and it was just that one population.
Just on back to the pest control
yes.
thing you mentioned with wolves. Yeah. a lot of the times I'm trying to identify photographs of things, and you'll search for what could be insects of some sort. Your first few pages are all about how do I stop these things coming in, how do I get rid of these things? You know, bloody hell, you know. No wonder we're running out of things.
Yeah. No, I'd say
It's-
anything from mole downwards, anything smaller, like all the small mammals, insects, you
Yeah.
know, everyone just
Just wants to kill them.
don't want them near me.
Lichens in lawns, how to get lichen out
Oh, I
of
know,
one.
yeah. Oh, what a shame. You've got beautiful biodiverse moss lawns, and people are going, how do I get rid of that and just have grass?
Yeah.
Good, thank you so much for that. It's been really interesting. There's lots of things for you to look at here. You can have a look at dissecting owl pellets at the top table there.
Beside the food.
Calendars.
Yeah.
Smell some otter poo if you want as well. But thanks so much, Matt. That was great. Yeah.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.